When Darth Bane started his career as a Sith, he was one of many students in Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness. History was full of Sith Lords coexisting and waging their wars against the Jedi, but unfortunately that coexisting wasn't always peaceful, and the Sith would regularly turn on each other. Bane changed all this, being inspired by the partnership of Darths Revan and Malak, destroying most of the Sith of his time and instituting a new rule. There would only ever be a master and an apprentice, one to embody power and one to crave it. After all, nothing says you're committed to the end of destructive infighting like nuking every single other member of the Order and making sure that anytime one of them dies, that it wipes out at least half of what remained. This is how you set up good institutional fortitude. We're going to talk about 3 different issues with the Rule of Two, and that's kind of the first one. There have been several dangers pointed out with there being so few Sith, putting the Order one hyperspace accident from entirely ending at any given time, but I feel like this other aspect is one which gets underreported. It's not like Bane was actually ending any of the infighting, since the infighting was baked into his system as well and it was a more fundamental part of it. The Master-Apprentice pair would only be stable until the Apprentice decided it was time to overthrow the Master, at which point at least half the Order was going to die, and in duels between very powerful Force users, it's not exactly going to be shocking if even the winner gets mortally wounded. Had Vader not been redeemed, he was still going to die after he killed Palpatine, for example. And yeah, the violent overthrow of the current ruler is what Bane wanted, but he didn't really seem to consider the fact that what he said he was trying to fix was not in any way addressed by his own system. The infighting was still part and parcel of what they were doing, it's just they had to do it in the privacy of their own home so no one else knew they were doing it, I guess. The second issue though, which is more of the main topic for today, is that nobody really listened anyways, and this is kind of what saved the Sith Order. Even in his own period as Master with Darth Zana, neither he nor Zana really waited for the other to die before starting to line up their own apprentices. Bane thought Zana was never going to crave power as much as he thought a true Sith should, and that instead she was happy to allow him to kind of age out and then just knock him off at the end. So he started seeking another apprentice, settling on the Itachi assassin who would later go on to be Darth Cognis. Zana had already been searching out potential apprentices, recruiting individuals named Hetton and Set Hearth, though neither survived long enough to actually take the position. And really, if the apprentice is teaming up with their own apprentice to take out the master because they're not necessarily powerful enough alone, is that actually in the spirit of the Rule of Two? Ultimately, Bane and Zana did have the showdown Bane always envisioned, but this was done with Cognis watching, pledging herself to like this video and subscribe for more as the apprentice to whomever emerged victorious, which turned out to be Darth Zana. We know a decent chunk of the Sith Lords who followed this pair, called the Baneite Sith, but only a couple have any real details, and these details either involve breaking the Rule of Two, or nearly breaking the Sith Order. Darth Cognis took Darth Millennial as her apprentice, but he became disillusioned with the lack of avocado toast and appreciation for his survival of the 2008 financial crash, but also with the Rule of Two itself, abandoning Cognis to start his own dark side cult, which would last through the Imperial period, called the Prophets of the Dark Side. So he was already out there teaching other dark side and even Sith teachings to other people. So while he left what was the current organization of the Sith of that day, I'd argue that he could still be considered a Sith. I also didn't really think that Sith Lord was a position that you could really resign from. I don't know if Cognis made him sign some sort of NDA before he left so he couldn't tell the Prophets that the Sith were still there. There is a Master and Apprentice pair where we never hear of either of them being in violation of the Rule of Two. This pair is Darth Gravid as the Master and Darth Gene as the Apprentice, about 500 years before the prequels. But this pair we also only know about because of how disastrous the Rule of Two almost proved to be. Gravid began to think the Sith teachings and the dark side alone were not that great actually, and started letting a little bit of light in. Not a full redemption, but he sometimes decided it might be nice to care about others. Moreover, he thought, as the sole inheritor of all Sith holocrons and other teachings, including knowledge of arts like essence transfer, if he destroyed these teachings, he could remake the Sith in his own image however he wanted. Darth Gene, a Twi'lek, confronted her master while he was attempting this. She killed him, becoming the Sith Master herself, and managing to save at least some of the Sith artifacts, though enough was lost that even by Palpatine's time, much of the information had still not been rediscovered, like essence transfer itself. Jean was unarmed during the confrontation, and as a result, she lost an arm, including her shoulder, half of her face, and a chunk of her chest. So while this doesn't include either of the Sith taking another apprentice, we have yet another example where the power transfer almost wiped out both Sith, as it did in the case of Vader and Palpatine, and where it might have been nice for them to each have someone waiting in the wings to maybe take over the Order if they both died. And this kind of brings up another question. There are a few Sith in Bane's line where we have no information at all on their adherence to the Rule of Two, or indeed much factual information on anything else either, like Darth Vectivus, Guile, and Ramage, or Ramage if you're fancy. But once we start getting to the prequel period, all Rule of Two bets are off. Darth Tenebris and his Twi'lek master followed the rule as far as we know, but once Tenebris was the master, he certainly didn't. While he was training his quote-unquote true apprentice, Darth Plagueis, he was also training a second apprentice in secret, the self-styled Darth Venomous. Plagueis didn't accept Venomous as a true Sith, but he did accept the list of Force sensitives Venomous had kept to search for possible apprentices himself, which he took after besting him. And I think this raises another question. One of the only reasons that this confrontation actually happened between Plagueis and Venomous is because Tenebris told Venomous that he wasn't alone. As a side note, Plagueis killing Tenebris was another example of the transfer of power nearly killing both Sith, since he was nearly caught in a collapsing mine and then stranded. He took Sidious as his apprentice, but while he never had a second one, Sidious started taking apprentices before he'd become a master himself. Darth Maul was trained by Sidious and accepted by Plagueis because they didn't really think of Maul as a real Sith, only an assassin. But Maul certainly didn't think this way, and if he had been left alone, he would have been allowed to continue on as the actual Sith Lord. At least according to the strict laws of the Rule of Two. Palpatine also considered Dooku, later Darth Tyrannus, as an apprentice alongside Maul, although I don't think they ultimately did overlap. Once Palpatine and Vader were in charge of the Empire, each took a plethora of apprentices, both secret and open. I've talked about several of these in recent videos, about different groupings of Force sensitives under their command, but Palpatine had essentially moved past the Rule of Two to the Rule of One anyways, where he alone would be the Sith Lord forever, so all apprentices were merely tools, not people who should ever seek to overthrow him. Something most Sith in charge before Bane probably thought as well, so there's not really much of a distinction there. This isn't a new kind of rule, this is kind of Palpatine going back to how the Sith had historically been. In many of these cases, like the Inquisitors, they weren't really taught about being a Sith directly, so much as just trained in the dark side more generally, which I think that is an important distinction. But some, like Lumaya, were in fact trained in Sith teachings. So I think this becomes a semantic game used too often under the Rule of Two. She wasn't the true apprentice, but for all intents and purposes, Lumaya was a Sith. Darth Cognis wouldn't really become Darth Cognis until Bane was dead and she was officially Xana's apprentice, but again, for all intents and purposes, she was already being trained to some extent as a Sith. And I think you can say something pretty similar about Maul after he comes back from the presumed dead. People say all the time that he wasn't actually a Sith anymore because Dooku and then Vader became Sidious' apprentice. But people like him, Ventress, and even Savage were being trained not just as dark side Force users, but in actual Sith teachings, just not necessarily in adherence to the Rule of Two. They knew Sith lore, they knew Sith legends, and so on. Under the Empire, Lumaya was in a similar situation. She was a Sith in everything but name, and then when Vader and Palpatine die, she takes on the mantle of Dark Lady of the Sith, later training Darth Caedus. And it's only really adherence to the Rule of Two which makes people question these claims. So this is my final problem with arguments around the Rule of Two, that it's ultimately a semantic restriction which suggests not adhering to this rule excludes people from being Sith. It turns Sith from a label with some philosophical meaning to basically a piece of specific bureaucratic box ticking. And all this despite the fact that it was a fairly recent invention in the big picture, and one where most of the Sith who claimed to adhere to it didn't follow it anyways. And this is always a bit of a problem with the Sith. They always think the new generation aren't as good as their own generation, so they'll all go and claim Darth Gravid or the One Sith weren't legitimate, even though he was also taught by ancient Sith holocrons. Or Lumaya and Caedus weren't legitimate because they didn't enter in through the Rule of Two, even though if Palpatine had died a little sooner, Lumaya could have officially been Vader's apprentice for like 30 seconds, and then she would have been seen as a legitimate Sith. Nothing about how she acted, believed, or was taught would have been different, she just would have followed a rule that was added kinda late in the game a bit more fully. You can certainly say they weren't true Baneite Sith, but that is a more specific distinction. If Millennial had killed Cognis before starting the Prophets of the Dark Side, would they then be the true Sith by Bane's rules, since the Master basically got to shape the path of Sith doctrine as we essentially see with Gravid and Palpatine? It's all fairly arbitrary and seems kind of self-defeating for the Sith, so Bane should feel bad. Especially with Millennial, this is like one generation removed from when Bane instituted the rule, so if it was thrown off at that point, it'd be hard to point to it as something that just throws away everything the Sith had always been doing. That's gonna do it for today though, thank you for watching, let me know what you think in the comments, and I hope to see you next time.